May 3rd, 2005. The phone rings at a French assistance center for minors and missing persons. On the other end, a man explains he was walking through the Atlantic Pyrenees and found a 15-year-old boy at the train station who was alone and very scared. That same day, a short, very thin boy arrived at the Child Protection Center. He wore a scarf covering half his face and a cap pulled down to his eyes. He had no cash or belongings, just a cell phone and a document stating his name was Francisco Hernandez Fernandez, born December 13, 1989. He claimed his family died in a car accident and he was in a coma for weeks. When he recovered, they sent him to live with an uncle, but the uncle mistreated him, so he fled. He was assigned a room at the protection center and enrolled in a school. At that school, caps weren't allowed, but Francisco was permitted to wear his, claiming his head was full of scars from the accident, which was true, and he didn't want to be mocked. He seemed like a typical teenager, but quite traumatized. In the changing rooms, he never changed in front of other students. He spoke softly, head down. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. Over time, he became more sociable and participative in class. The literature teacher asked another student, Rafael Pessoa, to help Francisco, but soon Francisco was helping Rafael. He was very intelligent. He became one of the most well-known kids in school. He knew a lot about English, music, and even ancient languages. Even in a talent show, he did a perfect Michael Jackson imitation. Later, in computer class, Francisco showed his new friend Rafael a chameleon image, saying he loved that animal. On June 8th, a school administrator ran into the principal's office. She said she'd watched a TV show the night before about the world's most famous impostors. She desperately told her the documentary featured Frédéric Bourdin, a 30-year-old Frenchman who impersonated children, and coincidentally, he was identical to Francisco Hernandez Fernandez. They looked him up online and all the information instantly appeared. If Frédéric was impersonating Francisco and was indeed 30 years old, he was even older than some of his own teachers. The police arrived, they summoned Francisco to the office, and there he admitted to being Frédéric, the real-life Peter Pan. He said that in the last 15 years, he had invented dozens of identities in more than 15 countries. Just to name a few of his many names: Benjamin Kent, Jimmy Morins, Alex Dole, Slađan Raskovic, Giovanni Petrullo, Michelangelo Martini, and so on. He always pretended to be an abused or abandoned child to gain people's sympathy. "I can become whatever I want. I am a manipulator," he confessed. He had faked identities in Spain, Germany, Belgium, England, Italy, Bosnia, Switzerland, Slovakia, France, Denmark, the United States, and so on. Hundreds of studies were done on him, and no signs of sexual deviation or pedophilia were found, nor any economic motive. Normally, people scam for money. In this case, it seemed to be purely emotional. Frédéric's childhood was quite complex. He knows practically nothing about his father and claims his mother had an attention deficit, and when he was a child, she would pretend to be very sick and make him run for help. Sometimes she even pretended to commit suicide to scare her son. When he was a child, he would pretend to have amnesia and deliberately get lost in the streets. Gradually, he began to impersonate other orphan children to live in different care centers. On June 13, 1992, he turned 18, his worst nightmare. He had lived his entire life in children's shelters and suddenly he couldn't be there anymore. He had grown up. In November 1993, he pretended to be a mute child, sat on the street asking for coins until firefighters took him to the hospital. Nobody knew anything about him. He even tried to get rid of his own identity. One day, the mayor of his town received a call from the supposed German police saying they had found Frédéric's body in Munich. But it was false. It was another one of his lies. By then, Frédéric had already accumulated quite a few criminal records for lying to the police and judges. Frédéric explained that before taking on a new identity, he imagines the child he wants to portray. He develops their biography, from their heritage to their tics. He said the key is that not everything has to be a lie. The simpler, the better. Then he creates the appearance, carefully shaving, plucking his eyebrows, using hair removal creams, and choosing his clothes very carefully. Of course, his physical build helped him a lot. In October 1997, Frédéric was in a correctional facility in Spain, detained for impersonating an adolescent. The juvenile judge gave him 24 hours to prove he was indeed an adolescent, or they would take his fingerprints, which Interpol already had on record. He knew that as an adult with a criminal record, if he were discovered, he would go straight to jail. So instead of inventing a personality, he stole one. He adopted the identity of a boy from Texas who had disappeared at age 13. But for that, he not only had to prove he was that American boy, but also convince the missing boy's family that he was that child. He asked permission to use the correctional facility's phone and called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Alexandria, Virginia. He spoke perfect English with the center. He said his name was Jonathan Duran, the president of a child protection center in Spain, and that a very scared child had appeared who didn't want to reveal his identity, but spoke English with an American accent. They asked him to describe the boy, and he began describing himself: short, thin, with a prominent chin, a gap between his teeth, and so on, and waited to hear what name they would give him. A woman from the center told him that the boy with him could be Nicholas Barkley, who disappeared on June 13, 1994, at age 13. Frédéric, without hesitation, told the woman that this was the boy next to him, and that it needed to be resolved immediately, and he sent to his family. He hung up and got a photo of Nicholas Barkley, and for the first time he thought he wouldn't be able to become him. Nicholas had a cross tattooed between his index finger and thumb and had light brown eyes and hair. He was completely different from Frédéric, who had dark hair and eyes. He looked nothing like me. Nothing. You know, the only thing I had in common with me was that I had 5 fingers at each hand. He quickly bleached his hair and asked a friend to give him a temporary tattoo similar to Nicholas's, but he still had to solve the eye problem. He invented a story saying he'd been kidnapped by a group of pedophiles, taken to Europe where he'd been tortured and abused, and subjected to experiments that involved injecting chemicals into his pupils, which changed their color. According to his story, he had escaped from a locked room when his guard left the door open. It was a very complicated story that went against his maxim: the simpler, the better, but it was his only way out. Days later, Frédéric received calls from Nicholas's sister and mother. The next day they traveled to pick him up. He put on a scarf to hide his face, sunglasses, and a hat. He thought the plan wouldn't work, but on the contrary, it worked perfectly. Nobody suspected anything. They arrived in the United States, and Frédéric, who was Nicholas to everyone, reunited with his family. He knew the names and appearances of his family members by heart, as his sister had shown him photos. Frédéric quickly adapted to the family, even going to Mass with them. Soon all the media reported on this great reunion.
Ken's 5 Eyewitness News. The disappearance without a trace 3 years ago. Tonight, a San Antonio boy is back home. Nicholas Barkley's now 16 years old. He vanished when he was 13. Nicholas says he was kidnapped and taken to Spain.
On November 1st, shortly after Frédéric settled into his new home with his new family, a private detective named Charlie Parker received a call from a news program producer who had heard the story that Nicholas Barkley had been reunited with his family. This producer of a rather sensationalist show was very interested in investigating to dismantle the pedophile network that had supposedly kidnapped Nicholas. Charlie Parker accepted and easily located Nicholas. They went to his new home with a producer and a camera, but the family didn't want Nicholas to speak on TV. But surprisingly, Frédéric insisted he wanted to do it, as if he needed even more attention than he was already getting. Frédéric began repeating the same story he told the police. Very well rehearsed, without errors. But while he spoke, the detective searched the house. He found a photo of the real Nicholas and began comparing it with the boy giving the interview. Something didn't add up. Charlie took the photo home and began comparing it with that afternoon's footage, frame by frame. Something about the ears seemed strange to him. He investigated if it was true that eyes could change color with chemicals, a very Mengele-esque experiment, and several doctors told him no. Parker called the authorities and told them his suspicions, but they didn't take it seriously. It was national news. It would be an embarrassment if the supposed Nicholas wasn't Nicholas, so he called the family directly. But it was no use. Nicholas's mother and sister were completely convinced that the boy who had been living with them for a month was Nicholas Barkley himself. Frédéric found out about this and called Charlie, telling him, "Immigration thinks I'm Nicholas, and the family does too," and hung up. 2 months after living with his new family, Frédéric started acting strange. He stopped going to school and was very moody. He knew his plan was at risk. He locked himself in his bathroom, grabbed a razor blade, and started cutting his face. They took him to a local hospital where he was admitted to the psychiatric ward, staying a couple of days until he was discharged. While there, he wrote in a notebook, "When you face monsters, be careful not to become one of them." But by then, authorities had already started doubting his story. An FBI agent named Nancy Fisher, who had interviewed the supposed Nicholas as soon as he arrived in the United States, was not entirely convinced. One day, Under the pretense of offering him treatment for the abuse he had suffered and his recent psychotic episode, she took him to Houston to see a forensic expert, who determined that Frédéric, due to his accent and physical build, was not American but French or Spanish. Nancy Fisher showed the results to Nicholas's mother, but she kept insisting that he was her son. Authorities didn't suspect Nicholas was Frédéric, this very famous impostor. They suspected something worse, at least worse for the government. They believed this Nicholas was a spy. Therefore, they contacted the CIA and asked for help. But the CIA would only help them if they proved this child was European and not American, as he claimed. The problem was that to prove that, they had to compare Nicholas's DNA with his mother's. Nancy Fisher asked Nicholas's mother for a blood sample, but she refused. Only 4 months later, she managed to get a court order to compel her cooperation. Days later, knowing Frédéric wasn't well, Detective Parker invited him to lunch. Almost instantly, Frédéric broke down. He'd been impersonating Nicholas Barkley for 5 months and was psychologically exhausted. Without prompting, Frédéric told Charlie, "I am Frédéric Bourdin, and Interpol was looking for me." Charlie went to the bathroom, called Nancy Fisher, and updated her. Parker returned to the table and kept Frédéric occupied a bit longer. Just enough time for authorities to arrive and arrest him. He offered no resistance. Soon after, DNA results and fingerprint matching confirmed Frédéric's identity. On September 9, 1998, Frédéric pleaded guilty. He claimed he was only looking for love. The judge compared giving a family false hope about their missing son to murder. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but was released early. In October 2003, after being deported to France, he again impersonated a child. He assumed the identity of a boy named Leo Bali, who had disappeared almost 8 years prior. But this time, police conducted a DNA test that quickly proved Frédéric was lying. In 2004, he posed as an Argentine boy in Madrid, claiming to be escaping his abusive, alcoholic father. But again, it was proven false. After a couple more arrests, including the one seen at the start of this video in 2005, on August 8, 2007, he married a woman named Isabel, a French woman who fell in love with him after seeing his case on television. Today, they have 3 children. Frédéric has a YouTube channel where he uploads videos talking or dancing to Michael Jackson songs. It's said that when he was getting married, he called his mother to invite her, but she didn't go, thinking it was just another one of his lies. To this day, Frédéric swears he's no longer a chameleon, that now he's just himself.